Many Asian Americans don't feel American or Asian enough to fit in anywhere, and this confusion can lead to self-hatred and chronic loneliness. And I know this because I personally went through this. I hated being Chinese in America, and now being Chinese American is one of my greatest points of pride. So I want to talk about how I overcame my own ethnic identity crisis, and maybe help some of you watching to do the same.
We immigrated from Hong Kong to a suburb near Kansas City in 2002 when I was 13 years old. Despite English being my first language, being the token Asian, I still felt like interactions with my classmates were 10 times harder than it should have been. Now, there was another classmate who is Chinese as well. His name is Jerry, but he got better grades than me, and my mother constantly reminded me of that. So there was no way I could have been friends with him.
You, Jerry!
If I wasn't going to fit in because I was Chinese, the next best thing was just to be ignored. But then William Hung, who's also from Hong Kong, got on American Idol and gave his now infamous rendition of a famous Ricky Martin song. And past that point, it was very hard to blend into the crowd because everybody around me was singing "Cheap bass, cheap bass," and asking more than a few times to sing and dance like him.
You, William Hung!
When I got to Missouri S&T, things got a lot better. Because at this engineering school, I met a lot of other students who was a nerd just like myself. And I also really enjoyed studying engineering. But because I was in the middle of Missouri, it was pretty rare that I would have an Asian classmate. So I didn't get to develop any Asian friends.
When I was 20 years old, I met my wife in St. Louis. And after dating for a year and a half, things started to get pretty serious between us. So I traveled back to China to visit my future in-laws. Now, they're from a smaller town in China called Quanzhou, which is where I'm at now. And they still carry some fairly traditional views. And I was reminded that my American ideals disqualifies me from being Chinese. And interactions with my father-in-law, who is a very authoritative figure in the household, weren't the most positive. And when I would run into Chinese locals, I would work really hard to get them to accept me as Chinese. But that didn't go well. Because at that time, my Mandarin wasn't the greatest. Now, I definitely don't sound like this guy. And I definitely don't sound like that guy. But for the way I looked, people were expecting me to be fluent. And when I opened my mouth and spoke like a toddler instead, I just confused and frustrated the store clerks and street vendors who often would react and just straight up yell back at me. And that made me feel very unwelcomed. Because I felt rejected by people in China, when I eventually came back to the US and began working at Morgan Stanley as a wealth advisory associate, I refused to seek out Chinese people as potential clients. Despite the fact that they really needed my help, a brand like Morgan Stanley would have been very attractive to them, and my career depended on it. I just couldn't handle the emotional pain of being rejected by my own people again, and so I chose to reject them first. And when I eventually left Morgan Stanley and I joined a privately owned wealth management firm in St. Louis, I worked there for a year and a half, and I often would find myself the only minority working there out of a staff of about 50 people. And it was like high school all over again, except this time way worse because there wasn't a bigger crowd of students that I could just blend into and be forgotten. Even though I worked with an incredibly talented team of certified financial planners, attorneys, and CPAs on staff, this is not an experience that I would want to repeat again. I ended up leaving that job for a host of other reasons without a new job lined up or a plan of what I wanted to do next.
And worst of all, I had no idea who I was because I didn't fit in anywhere. I wanted the world to change and accept me for who I was, and not just in America, but also in China. But how can I expect the world to do that when I don't even know who I am? But in some significant ways, the world did change for the better for Asian Americans. With the critical and financial success of Crazy Rich Asians and the rise of K-pop and K-drama, it really opened up how Asian Americans are seen. And there are now so many stories and movies made by Asian American actors and directors about their own story that still manages to transcend cultural boundaries. And as a Marvel fan, after watching Shang-Chi, that was definitely a highlight for me, and it gave me a lot of pride as an Asian American. My sister also loved watching Everything Everywhere All at Once, but it did confuse my mother a lot. Although we've come a long way from William Hung, that wasn't enough for me because I still had a lot of insecurities from 15 years of being the token Asian trying to fit in at work and at school in America. And then I became hopeless when I felt rejected in China when I thought that was the one place I was supposed to fit in. I needed to overcome my own problem, but I had no idea how to start. After I left my job, my wife and I went on a trip to Houston to a friend's wedding, and I was absolutely blown away with the size of the Chinatown there, which was also right next to a huge Vietnamese town section. I wasn't expecting this from a southern state like Texas, and we seriously contemplated relocating to Houston. And during this trip, I also met someone that would change my life. I met up with Christina Xu and her husband, Azaria Azini, and their 2 children, who reside in Houston. And if any of you remember them, Christina and Azaria were actually contestants in the 12th season of The Amazing Race. Christina competed with her father, Ronald Xu, who is my father's long-term friend. I shared with Christina how I didn't fit in anywhere, and that we were considering relocating to Houston. And then she asked me, "Have you found your community in St. Louis?" And I was confused and lost for words because I had never been asked that before. And I didn't have a good answer for her.
When I got back to St. Louis, I couldn't stop thinking about the question that Christina asked me. The way that she phrased the question, "Have you found your community?" made me realize that the chronic loneliness that I've been dealing with is something that I can actually take action over. And so I started a young Chinese professionals group and started organizing monthly social gatherings. So at first the group stayed small and it slowly grew from there. But word got out eventually that there was a group that was organizing social gatherings for Chinese people, and it exploded from there. It was difficult for me to manage my new job at TD Ameritrade along with my responsibility of organizing monthly get-togethers. But it was incredibly fulfilling work for me because this was an organization that's never existed before. I got to interview a former accountant who quit her job to become a full-time artist. We had bowling night, we had hikes, we had rock climbing day, and at our peak, we had a dinner with over 40 people showing up. There were also a couple of relationships that formed as a result of people meeting in the group as well. For the first time in my life, I had people just like me, Asians with an American upbringing, who I called my friends. Conversations were easy, and I never had the problem where I was in a group conversation and had no idea what anyone was talking about. And people were genuinely curious about what I had to say as well. And I didn't have to constantly work my network just to get invited to events and parties. Just being me was enough for people to want me around. I have found my community.
After 3 years, the group did lose momentum with the birth of my son and with the COVID shutdown happening a few months later. But in that short period of time, being with other people like myself and seeing how easy and fun it was for me to make friends undid years of past trauma. And now I still don't fully integrate into every social setting in America or in China, but that's not a pain point anymore. The world didn't have to change the way I wanted it to, because now I realize who I am, and I am a Chinese American without a need to pick sides. And since then, I've shifted my focus to building up my son's community of friends so he doesn't have to go through the same pain that I did as an immigrant child. And I launched a registered investment advisory firm focusing on providing fiduciary level of financial advice for Chinese immigrants facing a language barrier and for Asian Americans who want a financial advisor who's not only good at their job, but can also relate to them, especially around the sensitive topic of money and family. And going back to China this time was also different because I didn't try to force myself onto the Chinese locals to accept me as one of their own. I stayed there for 3 months in 2023, and whenever I stumbled over my Mandarin, I just admitted that I was from out of the country. And people were so nice to me and would in fact compliment me on my Mandarin. So now, my cultural identity is no longer a source of chronic pain and anxiety. Instead, it transformed into a source of pride and professional inspiration. And finally, I am going back to where everything got started, by moving back to Kansas City to be near my parents in their retirement. And because of my newfound confidence, I'm pretty sure that coming back to Kansas City this time will be a lot better than it was 2 decades ago. And if you don't think you can do all this because you've come to believe that you're socially awkward, you're an introvert, and nobody will ever want to hang out with you, don't believe in your own narrative. I would argue that you just never had a good environment to practice in. So go out there and build your own community. I know you can do it, and I wish you the best.